Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and this is Translation Notes. We are in the Gospel of Mark. I think I had publicized this as Mark 13:8 through 13. We will get through verse 10 today. There was more than I anticipated as I prepared for today. Maybe we'll look at verse 11. We'll see how it goes. But we are continuing to talk about this pivotal chapter in Mark's gospel, and also this chapter that has been the subject of much writing and speculation and people trying to figure out how to interpret it, which gives me a good occasion to remind everyone that my goal in these webinars, and we've worked on this together, is to look at the lexical and grammatical issues that come up when we translate the Greek text of Mark into English. And of course, by necessity, interpretation is part of that. Translation inevitably includes some level of interpretation. However, I will probably raise as many questions as I try to answer when it comes to when is Jesus talking about. I will offer some initial thoughts, and I've really valued your feedback throughout even just these first couple of weeks on Mark 13. But in the end, my goal at least is to help you and to myself grow in the ability to translate using accordance as the primary tool. I note too, if you're new to the Translation Notes webinars, this is not a feature-heavy webinar. We use accordance the whole time. We use multiple features in accordance, but this is not, here's how you do this particular feature or task in accordance, so much as here's a kind of overarching case study, which is translation. Here's how we use accordance to work for us. This handout that you're seeing on my screen is available to you in the GoToWebinar control panel if you're here live. If you're having an issue accessing that, please let me know. And the way that you communicate with me, there's a one-way typed chat. It's questions actually is the name of the box. It'll say questions there. You can type in any questions or comments at any time, and I'll respond. If not right away, I will pause along the way, but anytime you've got a question, you can ask it. This handout is also housed here at this tiny URL. It's tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. That will link you to a shared Google Drive where you can find this and every other translation notes handout. You can also email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com. So if you're watching this on a recording, because we are recording this today, this is the best way to access the handout. Unless there are initial questions or troubleshooting with getting set up, let's dive into the text. And let's review from last time just so we know where we are. It begins, we begin today in verse 8, but to get our context, to get our footing, Peter and James and John and Andrew, that's from verse 3, had asked him, so I put that in brackets, and then verse 4, tell us, Jesus, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign all these things are about to be fulfilled? And if you haven't been here before, by the way, I just follow the practice of numerous translations do this. If the text is not actually like literally in the Greek text, I'll put it in brackets. So this shows that this is a verbless clause, for example, in Greek. What the sign, all these things are about to be fulfilled. Well, that's more natural in Greek than it is in English, so we fill that out. And I try to use brackets just so we can be as precise as possible. What will be the sign? All these things are about to be fulfilled. And Jesus began to say to them, beware that no one deceive you. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he. And we had some discussion last time about that ego eimi. Is that just saying I am so-and-so? Is that also drawing on the divine title? Either way, many will come in my name saying I am he, or I am, if you like, and they will deceive many. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. It is necessary for these things to happen, but the end is not yet. So that's where we stopped last time. And again, just a little bit of review to situate us, because we benefit from this when we look at verse 8 today. Ta telos, the end, in verse 7, I noted last time, it does sound like a little bit of a climax so far in Jesus's speech. And so it's worth asking, is he answering the disciples' question? Now we've seen, and I said this last week, but we've seen Jesus answer questions directly, and we've seen Jesus respond to questions by answering them in a roundabout way or not answering them as such. Jesus knows what his mission is, and he knows what he wants to say, and so he may answer a question, he may ask a question in response, he may pursue what he sees as the question behind the question, or he may redirect altogether. So we just want to ask, with this extended speech, is Jesus answering their question? So far, it's hard to see a direct connection, but that's just something to keep in mind, because the disciples, and Mark, I think, uses this almost as a framing device, or at least a potential framing device. Mark uses these two questions to at least set our expectations, at least to let us know what are the disciples thinking. And those questions are, when will these things happen? And that's the destruction of the temple. That's in the first part of the chapter. And what will be the sign all these things are about to be fulfilled? So again, this is just context, it's review, but the disciples had asked, when will these things happen, namely the destruction of the temple or the events surrounding it? What will be the sign all these things are about to be fulfilled? And so when Jesus says the end, that sounds like it could be a destruction, at least in theory. And so that gives us at least, this should say, three interpretive questions to keep an eye on. Is Jesus conflating the end here in verse 7 with the destruction of the temple? In other words, is he responding directly to the disciples' question? Or is he talking about something else? And if he's not responding directly to their question, what is ta telos, the end that Jesus describes? So in other words, it could be that Mark/Jesus is using ta telos, the end, to be a sort of synonym to the destruction of the temple. It's also possible ta telos has what we would call a more eschatological meaning to it, like end time. And so the question before us is, when is this? When is this? Not in the sense of like, how can we predict the future, but when is Jesus talking about? Is Jesus talking about something more proximate or something farther off, or both, or some combination? I raise those questions because they're important for understanding the passage. I noted last time, and I raise this again because it will come up again today, as we translate, interpretation is important, it's inevitable. My goal is an accurate and readable translation that is as interpretation neutral as possible, which, good luck with that, right? I mean, I think probably every human overestimates their ability to be neutral or objective, or whatever word you want to use. However, my goal is to, if I'm 70-30 on an interpretation, but I don't want to bring that into the text. Maybe that takes the form of a footnote, or I just raise the possibilities and let the reader decide. What I want to do with ta telos then is just translate it as the end. It's a very safe translation, and it's still either, whether Jesus is talking about in the next century or in the next 3 millennia, ta telos works for either interpretation, and I'm not committing to one in my interpretation, and I think that's still an accurate translation of ta telos. So that's all review for last time, but that same dynamic, I think you'll see that's my approach to interpretation, and you'll actually see a lot of the Bible translations will do that too. That if there's going to be some interpretation of an ambiguous word, maybe let's not do that in the translation itself. That comes up maybe in the study note or in the commentaries or somewhere else. So that's my approach. Your approach may differ, which is fine. But I have translated it. The end, whenever that is not yet. So that gets us then into verse 8, and we'll see a very similar dynamic at the end of this verse. So I'll go over that again in a moment. But let's move into the Greek text. And as always, if you've got questions, you can use that questions box to communicate with me, and I will respond from time to time. But at any time, ask a question or make a comment. So verse 8, now we get what is essentially, I'd say, kind of a recapitulation of verse 7. Jesus says, let's go to accordance for this, and I need the Greek text open for that. Let's go to the NA28 and Mark 13:8. I'll make this nice and big, and all right. Egerthesetai gar ethnos ep ethnos, kai basileia epi basileian, esantai seismoi kata tapus, esantai limoi, arche odinon tauta. And if we go left to right, it's something like this. Will be raised up, or will raise up, or will rise up for, so that's post-positive. It occurs in the second position, although in English that's first. So for will rise up nation against nation, ethnos epethnos, and kingdom, basileia, epi basileian, kingdom against kingdom. Esontai, there will be, third person plural, earthquakes in places. We'll come back to kata tapus. There will be, esontai, so following that, limoi, there will be famines. The beginning of the birth pains, these things. Another verbless clause. Let's look at this in more detail. Here's how I've translated it. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. You could put kingdom will rise up against kingdom if you want, but this works perfectly fine in English. So I'm following the Greek closely here because I can, and that makes sense in English. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in multiple places. Come back to that. There will be famines. These are the beginning, or these are just the beginning, or some translations, these are merely the beginning of the birth pains. So this is, I think, a recapitulation of verse 7 and a development of it. Remember, in verse 7, we had, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. It is necessary for these things to happen, but the end is not yet. And by the way, as interested as I am, and maybe you are, in when is the end, what Jesus is really saying is don't be alarmed, and you don't really need to speculate either, because the end, all you need to know is it's not yet. I pointed to some commentator last week, I think it was R.T. France, who noted the irony of how much speculation has come from these verses, where Jesus is saying, be on your guard and follow me, but don't worry about the future. Don't obsess about it. Don't be alarmed. Anyway, so verse 7, wars and rumors of wars. And then we get in verse 8, nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Well, that sure sounds like a war to me. So I think that's a similar way of saying the same kind of thing, that they're in opposition to each other, whatever form that ends up taking. And then there's some further development here. There will be earthquakes in multiple places. There will be famines. So now we get the wars, or something like wars, opposition mentioned before and mentioned again, but now we've got something new, a kind of further development. There will be natural disasters as well, earthquakes and famines. And in verse 7, just to show how I think these are somewhat parallel, Jesus had said, in the case of wars, the end is not yet, whether we read that as the end of the temple or the end of all time or both or somewhere in between. Whatever the end is, it's not yet. And here he says similarly, even when you see nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and lots of earthquakes and lots of famines, these are just the beginning of the birth pains. So there's a similar move here by Jesus. This is similar in meaning to the end is not yet, although it might also develop it a bit by saying there's the beginning of the birth pains. Is he equating the birth pains to ta telos, the end? I think possibly, and I think that's a great question to explore in commentaries, and even how this word odinon is used throughout Scripture. And there's some great stuff you can find there that connects that to judgment, and That's well worth studying. Again, back to how I deal with ta telos in the end, I'm not sure that you have to have a decisive conclusion to be able to translate this well. I think some research is necessary, but in the end, just like I left verse 7 with ta telos as the end, here I render birth pains as birth pains, and then there's still that question of when and what exactly does this mean, but that doesn't necessarily make its way into the surface text itself. All right, so let's unpack the Greek a little bit more in this passage. This is egerthesetai, and we've got a future passive indicative third person singular, which we can see in the instant details if we didn't know that already. We've got the theis, we've got the the for the passive, the sigma for the future, and the tai for the third person singular, so egerthesetai. Now this, as passive, you wonder, could I translate this more passively, like nation will be risen up against nation, but that doesn't really make sense. The subject here is ethnos, and note it's neuter singular nominative, and ethnos here, neuter singular accusative. Looking at BDAG, in fact, we see, and I'll just triple click this. We have to scroll down a bit, but it's the 11th, number 11, this verb, and they locate the verse right here under this meaning in their entry, to move against in hostility, to rise up. And they say it's passive intransitive, of nations rising in arms. When I triple click on this, and let me know if you don't know how to do this, I'm happy to answer it, but you can set your default in accordance so that when you triple click on a Greek word, it gives you not only your lexicon of choice, which here is BDAG, it also will search the scripture reference from which you triple clicked. And again, if you don't know how to do that, please ask me in the questions, and I'd be happy to stop and show you. Once that's set up, as I triple clicked here, I got agero and I got Mark 13:8. So this says 2 exact hits, and the 2 exact hits are hit number 1 is agero, hit number 2 is Mark 13:8. So where is it? I can scroll. I can also advance by hit. So hit down and it takes me right there. So that's what I copied and pasted into your handout. Nation rising up against nation. And we could do the same with epi, this preposition. If we did the triple click here, epi, and it does have Mark 13:8, which is great because epi occurs so many times that chances are you click on a verse, it may not have your verse, but here it does. So I'm just going to click down by hit, or why don't we just scroll so we can see how long this entry is. I mean, this is a word that, all words derive their meaning from context, but epi is one where we really see that. So I'm scrolling down, and well, let's just go hit, and it's right here under number 12. So this is interesting. Not only is the translation equivalent against, but it's a marker of hostile opposition. So that seems like a very specific case. Again, we're free to check other lexicons, and maybe another lexicon sees this a little differently, but here we've got it with lots of other uses where this is like divided against himself is another example here. So it's the idea is nation will rise up against nation, divided against each other, in opposition to each other, hostile opposition. That's why I say this is a synonym to the war. The war is being prophesied in verse 7. And then just a parallel phrase here, kingdom against kingdom, with that same epi. Now here you've got the iota, the I letter, because there's a consonant here. It dropped off. Think of it as like how we do contractions in English, ethnos, ep, ethnos, because that's easier to say than ethnos, epi, ethnos. So it's ethnos, ep, ethnos, basileia, epi, basileon. So you have the iota there before the consonant. In case you're wondering why this is spelled differently, that's why. But it's really the same thing. Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And this is all in the handout. I haven't referred to the handout, but just remember, we're doing a lot of parsing today, but the neuter singular nominative and the neuter singular accusative, identical in spelling and form here, but accordance wonderfully parses them differently. And the second ethnos is after ep anyway. And if we missed that, when we get to kingdom, we have a feminine noun where the parsing does differ between nominative and accusative. So you've got nominative against accusative and nominative against accusative. Let me just say a couple other things and I'll stop for questions. This kata tapus is interesting. You could translate this a number of different ways, but it means something like in places, in a bunch of places. You could even triple click kata and see, do we have a scripture there? We sure do, which is great. So let's just scroll down and see how long this entry is. And here it is, marker of spatial aspect. Along, over, through, in, upon. And then here, BDAG gives us when it's kata tapus, in place after place. Max and Mary, in their grammatical analysis of the Greek New Testament, which sadly we don't have in accordance, but it's a great little volume. You might recognize it from the red, it's like a vinyl cover, but they just know this is distributive. So in various places. So topos after topos is where this occurs. And BDAG gives us in place after place. So you've got a decision to make here. I would not translate this as in places. You want that distributive quality, some way of showing that it's in place after place. It's in, I just did multiple places, which is maybe a little too generic or too general, but various places, lots of places, tons of places, depending on how colloquial you want to be. The idea here is there will be a lot. And then a bit of a contrast to that, you just get there will be famines. It doesn't say how many, it's plural, lemoi. You've got that masculine plural ending there. I'm sorry, feminine plural ending. And we don't know how many, but again, the idea is that there's going to be a lot. We've already got nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, place upon place with earthquakes, and then presumably famines in lots of places. I don't bring that out in translation. I just translate it as is. All of these are just the beginning of the birth pains. Now I'll just address this and then stop for questions. But this is worth a word study. So I'll triple click it. It's not a long entry. BDAG gives us experience of pains associated with childbirth. So we know what that is. Some watching may know experientially what that is. But that itself is pretty specific and clear. The question, well, and it's also a way of saying lots and lots of pain. The question is, and BDAG actually gives this nicely to us. There's a literal possibility here. So birth pains. And so in fact, you can see in this 1 Thessalonians 5:3, labor pains actually is how they render it here, coming upon a pregnant woman. And so that's still talking about a metaphorical use, but it's using a more drawn out literal description. So so this could have to do with like actual literal birth pains. And then BDAG also says in letter B, in imagery, great pain as in giving birth. So there's the idea of that is the amount of pain or the kind of pain that this person will feel. The question before us is, what's being talked about here? Is this more literal? Is it more figurative or metaphorical? There does not seem to be a birthing woman in view anywhere here, so it's hard to see this as literal. But you know, maybe the, I don't know, maybe you could think of the earth or the universe as it being in birth pains. We think about creation groaning. There's some possibility there. Either way, it appears to me, and certainly BDAG weighs in on this, that it's not the literal birth pains being talked about, it's imagery here. That still leaves another question, which I will simply raise and then stop with this verse, which is when or what kinds of things or where are we? When we talk about birth pains, is this again just talking about the immediate destruction of the temple? Is it talking about something way off in the future? Again, we had that with tatelas, remember? And we end the verse in the same way. And I'm just going to do what I did with tatelas, which is translate it birth pains, and then leave the question of interpretation, but not leave it aside, but maybe raise it, maybe weigh in on some possibilities. If I were writing a study Bible note, I would do more than what I'm doing now. But I would maybe say, some people suggest this, other people suggest that. But you've got a note here in BDAG, which is interesting. This is more commentary than BDAG often gives, but it does raise the possibility that this is specifically end time woes. And that sounds to me like it's taking us past the 1st century. And you may agree or may not agree, and lots of people have agreed and lots of people have not agreed. But it's there in BDAG. This would be a great place to check your commentaries. A really good quick overview is going to be SIL Exegetical Summary Series, and they will typically, I did not put this in your handout, but they will typically answer the questions that are on our minds. And here, what is implied by calling such sufferings birth pains? So it's talking about the amount of pain, but there are some commentaries that talk about when this might be, and you can see those listed there. All right, let me stop there. I want to hear from you. I would love to hear comments or questions that you've got. Again, I think the line we're trying to walk here is we want clarity in our translation. So it may be that it's not very clear in translation to say these are just the beginning of the birth pains. So if you can get it clearer, even if you have to interpret, maybe that's worth it. On the other hand, the Greek doesn't seem to do that, so maybe you leave it as is. I can see both ways. I'd love to hear from you. This is what I've got on verse 8, but let's see what comments or questions folks have. Here's one that came in a little while ago, and I will put it in. If I share your questions, I'll always do it anonymously, but this is one that I want to respond to. Well, I want to respond to both. So here's one. Somebody said, and this was a little while ago, since Jesus spoke about wars and rumors of wars as not signaling the end, someone says, then he may not have been speaking of 70 AD here. So if I understand you, any wars or rumors of wars that they would have heard, they're so close to 70 AD, but these are not the wars you're looking for, essentially. And so this comment goes on, were there wars and rumors of wars between 30 and 70 AD? I'm not aware of anything significant. Thus, the end, whatever it is, it might not be 70 AD as some might speculate. That's a great comment. And that's a great framing question for further research then, is if there were wars and rumors of wars between 30 and 70 AD, it seems like it would be easier to research the were there wars part of that question. And if you find some, then that would seem to suggest that it would be evidence for Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple. If you don't find any wars, then that would be evidence in the other direction, which I think is what this comment is suggesting. That if they have not yet heard wars and rumors of wars, then it's not yet the end, and so it's not the destruction of the temple that's being talked about here. So that's a great comment, and I think without stopping to do the research right now, I can just affirm that those are great questions and insights. And I think, yeah, that question then of what wars are we looking at between 30 and 70 AD? How would that be constituted? I mean, you could, just to give a couple directions here, and folks may have their own comments on this, but you could look at your timeline in accordance. You could do a search for war in research. I think historical background commentaries. I haven't been using commentaries very much today, but I think a historical background commentary will probably give you something like that, hopefully. But that would be another direction I would go. I would look at Keener here. The end was often portrayed, Jesus said these sort of, yeah, he's not weighing in on any particular wars that may have occurred there or rumors of wars. But yeah, that's a great direction. So great comment and question. Thank you for that. Let's see what else we've got. Okay, so here's another comment that I'll put in the chat and respond to. Somebody says verse 7b and c, word order, Jesus' emphasis is not yet is the end. Let's look at that. Yeah, that's right. But not yet the end. And so that would be something that you could bring out in translation. And then this comment goes on, verse 8 begins with gar to explain further the prior clause, not yet the end. Right, so that's a great connection. So that gar connecting tightly to the end kind of links those two together. This comment continues, verse 8 is a new increase in extent and severity of fighting over verse 7. Okay. No longer just battles and reports, but whole nations are in conflict. Great. The early stages of birthing. Great comment. Yeah. Yep, that's right. I appreciate that. All right. Some great comments here. Here's a great comment. Oh, this is great because this gets us knee deep into the Greek. Nations will rise against nations, singular, not plural. Just a thought. Yeah, let's. You've got this is singular, nation against nation, and you can see that from either the parsing, or if you don't remember the parsing, which I will confess is often true in my case. The instant details will tell you that you've got a singular here, and same thing with kingdom against kingdom. But that's you're quite right in terms of I mean what's in the text. If we just read it left to right, it is saying nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. The meaning is you know, multiple nations, multiple kingdoms. So I've preserved the singular just because that's what's in the text. But yeah, that's a great point. I mean, clearly it's talking about multiple nations. It's not just, in other words, I would not translate this as one nation will rise up against one nation and one kingdom, or a kingdom against a kingdom. This still preserves the singular, but also shows that the meaning is plural. So thanks for pointing that out. Okay, here's another comment. Someone says, like a woman in labor, there is no escape. So that metaphor, yeah, I think is worth thinking about. And again, as we do it, I think we want to take Jesus and Mark on their terms, which again, I really think there is a caution here to the disciples. We can decide interpretively how much does that apply to me as I read this text, us as we read this text. There is a caution even in the text to be on guard against certain things, and that even when you see this, it's not the end. So I think really to focus on what the text does say rather than what it doesn't say. And what it does say, yeah, is it's talking about these birth pains. So I think really exploring that metaphor and even looking at how it is used throughout Scripture would be worthwhile. I mean, you could even just do a quick search of the Septuagint to see how it's used. We've got a number of hits there, so that's also worth looking at. Let me see. Yeah, here's another great, these are great comments. I really appreciate these. Somebody says, as I stated last time, can it be both literal and metaphorical, and two time horizons, initial and final? Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Here's another comment. Lots of rumors of Roman, I assume that's wars coming in 60, 65, 67, 68. Josephus gives some insights. Israel against Rome, singular. Yeah, Josephus would be a great place to go for this. Yeah, and again, I don't know if by the time we're done with chapter 13, I mean, I hope that all of us have a better understanding of when we think all of this might be. And I can't imagine we won't. I mean, we're just going so deep into it. And I just already have a sense from having studied this before that even with that, I will probably walk away saying, here are the options. Here's what makes the most sense to me. I'm not sure. So as far as this when question, I think that's still there and it's definitely important. So we'll continue kind of revisiting that as we go. But whenever we are, all of these things, tauta, are just the beginning of the birth pains. So let's go on to verse 9. Thanks so much for the awesome comments and questions. Please keep them coming. You don't have to wait for me to stop. I will catch up and make sure we get to them. All right, so verse 9. I don't know how we ended up in Genesis. Here we go. Blepete de humes heautus paradosusin humas es sunedria kai es synagogas dareteste kai epi hegemonon kai basileon statheseste heneken emu es marturion autois. We get a little bit of a longer verse now. Let's go left to right, and then I'll give you my finished translation. Blepete, see to it, beware, watch out, beware. So you got day and or but, beware, you with yourselves or amongst yourselves. Paradosusin, they will hand over humas, you, es sunedria, to the councils. This word, you see it in the transliteration, could be Sanhedrin, but this appears to not be that technical use, but the more generic use of city councils. We'll talk about that. And in synagogues, you will be beaten. Kai epi hegemonon, and to or in front of governors and kings. Statheseste, you will stand. We've got another passive verb here. You will be stood. You will be stood in front of, on account of me, and as a witness to them. All right, here's what I've got. But you must beware. They will hand you over to local councils, and in synagogues you will be beaten, and before governors and kings you will have to stand on account of me as a witness to them. Local is that, whatever the Greek word for that may be, is not there, but I brought that out with the brackets there to show that Sunedria, and there's a footnote on this, but that's councils in general, so like city councils. And then this have to, I put that in brackets because I wanted to bring out the force of this passive. That, I mean, they're not, it's not clear that they're like choosing to stand in front. They're being handed over, so it's against their will, or it's not their choice. And so if there's a way to bring that out with stand, great. If not, fine, you will stand on account of me before them. I mean, I think that's clear because they've been handed over, but I just put the have to in there. This word order is not the smoothest in the world. I kept it like that to preserve the word order of the Greek. But you'll notice different translations make this even a little smoother. In fact, they'll even take, they will hand you over, and have it be, you will be handed over to local councils and beaten in synagogues and stand before governors and kings, just to make it a little smoother. But I've not opted for that. I wanted to keep it as close to the Greek as possible. So blepete, that should look familiar. That was in verse 5. And Jesus began to say to them, blepete, that was his very first word of this speech. It's not to say, well, I mean, it is to say, maybe it's one of the more important words. It's the first thing he said. So it's just interesting. He led off with a on your guard, which does not answer when will these things happen. Again, as we're saying, maybe he's answering that, maybe he's not, but his first answer is be on your guard. So that seems to be of some importance, and that's confirmed by seeing it again here. Blepete, be on your guard. So we might also just go back and see, how do we translate that in verse 5? I had beware. So I personally just want to be consistent with that. If you had stand on your guard or something like that in verse 5, I would just do the consistency check and keep it the same here. You've got a little more emphasis here than in verse 5, humes heautus. Max and Mary give a literal translation, just so we can see it, of look you to yourselves. Look you to yourselves. And then they suggest be on your guard is a translation. I have you must beware. Another possibility, as for yourselves, watch out. But the Greek is saying something like you watch out for yourselves. And I think maybe more important than understanding how these words fit together grammatically is the act of emphasis that Jesus is doing here. Again, it's plenty emphatic just to say beware at all, but it was just beware here in verse 5. So I do think there's a little bit more here. So whether you read that as an escalation in tone or not, maybe that's overreading it, but I think it needs to come out in translation some way more than just beware. So you must beware, or be really careful, or maybe you want to preserve the heautus in particular. You yourselves beware. You'll see different translations handle this differently. So with that said, he's talking about now what to beware, why they need to beware. He's going to develop this further, Jesus is, in verse 9. And we get paradosusin. This is third person, future active indicative, third person plural. They will hand over you, they will hand you over. That raises the important question of who is they? Who's going to be doing the handing over? And I just note in the handout, there could be specific people Jesus has in mind. And certainly there will be specific people, provided the prophecy comes true, which appears that it will. There will be specific people doing the handing over, but grammatically, paradosusin, it can also just function as that impersonal third person plural, they. Like in English, you know what they say, a bird in hand is better than two in the bush, or often when we introduce sayings like that, we'll say that. Or conventional wisdom in English, we often proceed by saying, they say, or they're saying there's going to be snow tomorrow. Well, who are the they? Well, probably I'm talking about the weather people, but I'm actually not being very specific. I'm just saying it is being said. So really, you could take this also as having the force of the passive verb, which some translations do. You will be handed over. So when you see they will hand you over, future active, third person plural, and your favorite translation gives you will be handed over, rather than thinking our favorite translation got it wrong with the parsing, they probably know the parsing. They're just interpreting how the third person impersonal plural is used, which is having that same passive force. So I don't mean to over explain that, but I do mean to say that there are translations that say you will be handed over, and maybe they will hand you over sounds too generic. You don't gain anything from the they anyway, so you just switch it to second person. I tend to not favor that approach, but I certainly am not opposed to it. Either way, Jesus and Mark don't specify who's doing the handing over. Again, not the point. The point is to beware. Someone's going to come and hand you over, and they'll presumably know when those people get there. Just briefly on the councils, and then I'll turn to comments or questions you've got. Let's look at this word in the text. We've got, here it is, Synedria, triple click. You can see it in BDAG, a governing board council of a local council as it existed in individual cities. And the NET Bible has a nice note. I put it in your handout, but let me show it to you here in accordance. This is a great text, by the way, because it has, if I click this open, it has a lot of these kinds of notes. Like here, this is what we just went over. In Mark 13:9, it says you will be handed over. So again, what I said about the parsing, it's not that they got the parsing wrong. In fact, they even note here, the Greek has, they will hand you over. They is an indefinite plural, referring to people in general. The idea you will be handed over. So the NET Bible is great because it has lots of notes like this all throughout. I mean, they'll even tell you when they don't translate a kai for and, or when they translate it as so. I often refer to this in the translation notes webinars, and I often use it when I'm making a translation. If you don't have it in accordance, of course, you could purchase it. You could also go to, it is freely available online. I think it's just netbible.org, and you can go right into Mark 13, and it's got the footnotes right there in the text. In fact, you can do this in a web browser in accordance. So anyway, that's the NET Bible. So their note on councils here is that in this context, it has a non-technical sense. In other words, it's not referring to the Sanhedrin, capital S, it's plural anyway, referring to local judicial bodies, courts, attached to the Jewish synagogue. These courts would be responsible for meting out justice and discipline within the Jewish community. And this would probably be worth, I would even take this word and I'd want to see how else it's used in the Greek New Testament and elsewhere. I'm not doing it right now, but just out of curiosity, what did this look like? What was the trial like? Did they get legal representation, and how fair was it, and all that stuff? How did it work? Those are all interesting questions. So you might even in translation do something like you will be handed over to courts. But I think councils is a good bet here, or governing board, local council, city council. You've got some translation options here. But I think maybe the most important point here is that this is not, at least I haven't seen anyone arguing for this. This is not the Sanhedrin, capital S here. We're talking about these local instantiations. And beaten in the synagogues. I'm not exploring those phrases in the handout, but you might think about, it's not fun to think about, but you might think about, do you want to get more specific, like is flogged a better translation here, even whipped? That could be worth looking at. You could also see when that happens in the New Testament. And maybe this kind of helps us figure out the timing question. Here it is. They summoned the apostles and had them beaten. So that seems to be some level of fulfillment of that. So I'm not going to go further with that word unless you have comments or questions. I think something like beaten is good. It may be flogged more specifically if you like. But yeah, you must beware. They will hand you over to local councils or just councils, and in synagogues you will be beaten, and before governors and kings you will have to stand on account of me as a witness to them. I did not make comments in the handout on this last part of the phrase, but I will come back to it when we talk about verse 10, this idea of a witness to them. That was less comment on that verse, but I'm eager to hear from you if you have comments or questions, especially if you have been thinking about something and aren't sure whether to share it. Always share it, and I'll respond as I'm able. Let me just check the questions here. Okay, here's a question. Somebody says in Mark 13:9, Jesus seems to not only foretell the judgments, persecutions, and all the things he would go through, but also seems to let the disciples know they should prepare for martyrdom. Do you think the disciples knew this meaning? That is such a good question. That's a great question. The way that I would answer this, I guess my answer is I don't know, because even when he's talking about his own suffering, and I really appreciate your connection to that. We've seen in Mark how long it takes them to really get that, and even then they don't fully get it. The way that I would answer this question, though, is I would see, all right, this is a long speech. How do they respond? Do they say, well, surely not us, Lord? Unfortunately, we don't get any of that in this chapter, so we don't know how they respond, at least in Mark. We could check the parallel gospel accounts. I would go further and see if we get anything, but we really don't. So it's hard to say. And in terms of speculation, I'd be curious what you think. There's already these moments in Mark where the disciples just have brilliant insight, and other moments where they just totally miss it. So yeah, hard for me to say, but it's a great question. It's a really good question. That'd be a great small group discussion question if you were taking folks through this passage. Feel free to circle back with a follow-up. Here's another comment. Somebody says Jesus' first response to the disciples when and what questions is to fortify and warn. Yep, verses 5 and following, 9 and following, blepo twice. That's right. The disciples against their imminent earthly lifetime events, most historical events recorded in Acts. Yeah, again, there's a real immediacy here. I appreciate your pointing that out. And I think it was in the handout last week. Nope, here it is. It's right here. I put it, it's at the top of page 2 this week. It was in the handout last week, but I put it here again. Similar to this comment, the disciples, Edward says, and believers since want to know the future, but Jesus directs them unflinchingly to the present. Watch out that no one deceives you. I didn't include the footnote there. There's a running admonition against future speculation at the expense of present obedience, because that is what Jesus is after. Jesus is not just after not speculating, but there is a beware, be ready. We're not going to get very far into this, but when he starts talking about the persecution, do not worry about what to speak, but say whatever is given you at that time. Now they've got a specific directive. I mean, beware is already a specific directive, but they have another one that they need to follow. I mean, really, they're going to need all of their energy and mental focus on obeying this, as Edwards puts it. So I really like that quote, because I think it kind of keeps us in the immediacy of the text. Not that we can or even should try to avoid the larger interpretive questions, but I think as we approach them, it needs to be with that immediate context in mind. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That just to read that comment again, Jesus's first response to the disciples when and what questions is to fortify and warn, with blepo twice, the disciples against their imminent earthly lifetime events, most historical events recorded in Acts. Great comment. Let's do verse 10, and I think we can do verse 10. We finished verse 10 today. It's very short. The Greek is very easy. The meaning, well, we'll see. But all right, so as a witness to them, kai es panta ta ethne. There's nations again, by the way. These nations who are against each other. But kai es panta ta ethne, proton, de ke rukthenai ta euangelion. Left to right, and to all the nations. First, it is necessary to proclaim or to preach the gospel. I've translated that. And first, it is necessary to preach the gospel to all nations. You might just need to fiddle a little bit with word order here. I think what I was trying to avoid was a split infinitive in English, which is typically seen as not ideal style. So you've got some like, first the gospel must be preached to all nations, and the gospel must first be preached to all nations. The gospel must first be preached to all the nations, and to all the nations first it is necessary to preach the gospel. That's a left to right translation. Something that's readable, and I mean, I think all of these are faithful to the Greek. But in terms of orienting ourselves, de is the main verb of the sentence. We would see this pretty easily in our diagrams. I mean, maybe you diagram it yourself, but you've also got these diagrams in accordance as a separate module. So here it is. So we've, with these Reed-Kellogg diagrams, we've got this horizontal line split in half by a vertical line, subject at the left, predicate at the right. So main verb here is de. So if you read this grammatically, it's something like, and the gospel to be preached to all the nations first is necessary. Now, you would not translate it that way, but it does just show us that de is the main verb. In fact, it is present active indicative third person singular. It is necessary to, it is asking or wanting an infinitive. It is necessary to what? To proclaim. And in fact, this is, note the thenai ending, aorist passive infinitive. So you get an infinitive verb here, complementary infinitive, because it completes or complements the thought of it is necessary to. What is necessary? Necessary to preach the gospel to all nations. And I don't want to understate the importance of this. We are we are in the, I had said in the weeds initially in the handout, but I realized I was mixing metaphors. We are in the trees in this chapter, but we want to see the forest too. Evangelion, I think, ought to remind us of this theme in Mark. Mark began with this word, arche tu evangeliu, Jesu Christu, huiu theou. Was it 3+ years ago that we started this series? I think it was fall of 2021, which is very hard for me to believe. But anyway, here we are, which is awesome. Thanks be to God. That word really sets the tone in a lot of ways for the Gospel of Mark. And it comes up again. And we've discussed this multiple times throughout. So I don't think this is just a kind of, I mean, it's a short statement, and it's amidst all of these dramatic things like wars and being handed over and beaten. I mean, it's very easy to focus on those, which they're supposed to focus. He says, beware. And there's also this wonderful kind of bringing in of this larger theme, this bigger picture here of preaching the gospel to all nations. So I don't want to what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to undervalue that or underemphasize that. I don't know how you do it in translation. I think you just translate it as it is. But I think this word hopefully gives us some pause. I can only imagine this is deliberate on Jesus and Mark's part. Of course, I don't know for sure, but it certainly harkens back to Mark 1:1. Also, this preaching of the gospel. Kerusso comes up throughout Mark 2, even together with Evangelion. You've got Mark 1:14. So I would stop here as I did when I prepared. I didn't put anything in the handout, but I would right click on this word. I would search for the lexeme. I would skip ahead to Mark in the go-to box. And by the time I get to 13:10, I've already had it in these passages. And it turns out each of these passages are, they're pretty key passages in the book. So I would just spend some time with those. I would do the same with the word preach. I would word search that and just kind of make sure I have a sense of what is being talked about when Mark and Jesus talk about preaching and talk about the gospel. And what is the gospel? We've had discussion on that before. I won't go into that now, although you will want to decide, do I translate this as gospel lowercase g, gospel capital G, or even good news? We can revisit that next time if there's interest, but that is something that's come up a couple times already. But super important point here. First, it is necessary to preach the gospel to all nations. That not only is important within the context of the chapter, but it reminds us of this broader theme in the book. So I think there's maybe a bit of grace there on the part of Mark and Jesus, that as and I'll just speak for myself, as I am super curious about the when, where, and how, and also, honestly, I mean, it's appalling to think about being beaten in a place of worship. I mean, that's horrific. So it's hard not to focus on that, which again, don't not focus on it. But there's also this good news, literally, that's going to be preached to all nations, and that's still necessary. So Jesus is saying, even amidst all this other stuff, here is the mission and the vision. I will close with 2 comments, and then if you've got comments and questions, please put them in the chat. 2 comments. One is this, well, it's really more of a question. Who must do the preaching? Doesn't say explicitly. First, it is necessary to preach. De keruxthenai. In fact, this is not even, I'm not sure this is the best translation. You might say, first, it is necessary for the gospel to be preached to all nations. I tried to preserve this infinitive how it was. It is necessary to preach. But it is in the passive, so you could say for the gospel to be preached. But it's still, the text does not answer who does the preaching, because the verb of necessity here, de, does not have an explicit subject attached to it. However, this goes back to the last verse, I think, where the disciples are standing before governors and kings on account of Jesus, for Jesus' sake, as a witness to them. So I think there's a link there between witness and gospel, and even Kai maybe brings that out. So Jesus does not say it is necessary for you to preach, but I don't think he has to. I think it's clear that they're the ones doing the preaching, and one of the ways they're doing that, not all of the ways, but one of the ways is by standing on account of Jesus before governors and kings as a witness to them. And we'll see more how Jesus develops this in verse 11. We're stopping even mid-paragraph today. But first it is necessary for you, and again, I wouldn't bring that out in translation because it's not there, but the you would be the disciples. And again, one of the ways they will do the preaching is by being a witness amidst the persecution they face. Second and final comment is just to say, here is in your handout. I won't go over this, but if you want to read more, we'll pick up with this next time. There's still this question of when and first it is necessary to preach the gospel to all nations. Well, first as in before what? And you'll see this is straight out of the SIL Exegetical Summary series. I just leave that there for your consideration. Once again, really not a hard translation decision. Proton means first, but the meaning is still there, left to be understood. And so there's some options here. I'll leave off with that today because we're at time. We'll pick up next week on verse 11 and see how far we go. I'm happy to take any other comments or questions if you all want to stay on a couple minutes. If you want to go, let me end the recording here. And so for those of you who are watching, again, the information that you need to get the handout or reach me is up at the top. And thanks so much for watching the recording.